Death at Bishop's Keep. Chapter 24. Errors, like feathers, on the surface flow. She who would find the truth must dive below. After Charles Dryden, All for Love. With a murmured excuse to Aunt Sabrina and the others, Kate left the group and looked around, wondering suddenly why everyone had come. If Beryl Barnwell had expected to witness magical rites or meet unconventional people, she was disappointed, for the men and women crowding the rooms, with the exception of Mrs. Farnsworth and the effete Oscar Wilde, were quite ordinary in their dresses and in their demeanour. The only interesting thing about them, she realized suddenly, was that most of the men wore a cluster of blue feathers in their buttonholes, while the women wore some item of exotic feather jewelry, feather earrings, a brooch, or a pendant. She looked around, trying not to stare. What was the significance of all these feathers? Was the feather she had discovered in the seat of the chaise connected to the feathers in this room, or was it simply some vast coincidence? Kate ventured into the dining room, where an elaborate tea was laid out on the sideboard. She put a cucumber sandwich on a china plate, allowed a maid to draw a cup of tea from a large silver urn, and went to stand behind a leafy thicket of potted bamboo, where she could watch and form an opinion without being observed herself. Over the next few minutes she counted no fewer than 9 men arrive at the table wearing blue feathers boutonnieres in their lapel. She was distracted from her observations by Mrs. Farnsworth, who appeared at the table with a well-fed gentleman with neatly trimmed grey side whiskers. Above the whiskers his cheeks were a mottled red, and his grey brows were drawn together in a scowl. The two of them stood together on the other side of the bamboo, talking intently, so deeply engrossed in what they were saying that they paid very little attention to their surroundings. Kate, feeling as invisible as one of the servants, moved closer. "Damned charlatan!" the gentleman exploded furiously. "How can he behave with such unfraternal ingratitude?" He hunched his shoulders inside his frock coat, and his mouth twisted. "I have been completely misled." The cords of Mrs. Farnsworth's neck tightened, but when she spoke her voice was soft, her touch on the gentleman's arm delicate. "My dear Wynne, I do understand your dismay, but you must not allow Mather's churlish behaviour to distress you. That his accusations are utterly unfounded," the man exclaimed. "Reckless, baseless, unsubstantiated, and I shall prove it." His voice rose and his side whiskers trembled with passion. "I shall prove it, in open count if need be. I have documents attesting to the antiquity of the manuscripts, a letter from Woodford, an affidavit from the German translator." Miss Farnsworth made a small mouth. "But if you so openly answer the man's effrontery, do you not also open our order to public challenge? That, I fear," she added with light reproach, "would be a disaster." Mrs. Farnsworth's reproof was casual, and the toss of her head was perfectly artless. But Kate heard the artful modulations in her tone, and saw that her glance spoke even more subtly. This woman was indeed a skilled actress, and there was a great deal of passion concealed by her art. The gentleman pulled himself up. "But it'll be a disaster if he makes this challenge public and I do not answer him." "Then we must do all in our power to keep the wretched man from making the challenge public," Mrs. Farnsworth said. Her tone was silken, but there was barely a definable edge. "If the confidence of the members is shaken, or the reputation of the order is tarnished in the eyes of others, we could all be ruined. There will be no public display." Kate had not the least idea what she meant, but the man appeared to understand and, reluctantly, to agree. "Very well," he said disgustedly. His face was flushed with anger, and his neck bulged over his stiff wing collar. "I will agree to say nothing at this time." He raised his voice slightly. "But I cannot promise for the future, Florence. I have my honour to consider and my good name. If that miscreant Mathers continues to make unprincipled charges against me—" "My dear Wynne," Miss Farnsworth said with easy affection, "that is all I ask. A few weeks' reprieve while I shepherd our fledgling group here in Colchester through its delicate formative phase. Our new temple will be consecrated shortly, and then you may have it out with Mathers and end his absurd challenge to Fraulein Sprengel's warrant and your authority." She stopped and looked up at the man. Her voice held a bitterness so slight that it was almost indiscernible. "I believe you. Understand me." The man puffed out his cheeks. "I do, my dear. Yes, of course I do. I certainly do, and I'm prepared at any moment to defend—" "Thank you." Miss Farnsworth smiled lightly, but there was a shadow in her eyes. "And where are the papers in question?" A slight frown crossed the gentleman's florid face. "The papers? They were left with the other historical documents." Mrs. Farnsworth's remarkably mobile face darkened into a frown. "Is that not dangerous?" The man made a harumphing sound. "I hardly think so. Their significance is not apparent to—" "You're quite right," Miss Farnsworth said, half to herself. "Their significance would only be apparent under the most expert examination, and that they will not receive." She reached up to touch his cheek with the tip of one finger. It was the lightest of touch, and hardly indiscreet, but it revealed a long-standing intimacy. The man compulsively caught her hand and kissed it. "Thank you, my dear," he said fervently. "You have ever been the genius of my better self." "Yes," she said. The man moved away into the crowd, leaving Mrs. Farnsworth standing alone, apparently lost in thought. After a moment she seemed to recollect herself and stepped to the side of the table, where she smilingly engaged in conversation with Vicar Barfield Talbot, whom Kate had been expecting to see. The vicar, too, was wearing a cluster of blue feathers. Kate waited her chance to slip unobserved out from behind the palm, only to bump immediately into Aunt Sabrina. "Ah, here you are, Catherine," Aunt Sabrina said. She looked around at the table, heavily laden with silver trays of olives ranked like fish scales, radishes arranged like the rays of the sun, and anchovies interlaced basket-style in an elaborate display. There were fine plates piled with meringues, jellies, and crystallized fruits, and the whole was centered with an elegant trifle. "Is this not a fine repast?" She picked up a small plate and began to help herself. "Oh, look! Mushrooms! Stuffed! I never miss a chance to eat mushrooms in any form." At that moment the vicar said an affectionate farewell to Mrs. Farnsworth and came toward them. "Good afternoon, Miss Artley," he said to Aunt Sabrina. "My dear vicar," Aunt Sabrina said warmly. She looped her arm through his and drew him closer. "And, of course, you know our proposed neophyte, my niece Catherine." "Ah, Miss Artley," the old man says. His bow was gallant. "I am glad to learn that you wish to join our order, my dear. I applauded your orange wish to be reunited with you and to use your skills to our advantage, but I admit to feeling much more comfortable that the order's historical material is in the hands of one of its members. The Golden Dawn is an esoteric society, and its rituals must be guarded from the eyes of the world." "Of course," Kate murmured, although she hadn't happened upon anything yet that the eyes of the world wouldn't be allowed to see. She wondered whether the Order's much-vaunted secrecy might be a smokescreen that concealed its complete lack of any substance. "Do you have any questions I might answer, my dear?" the vicar inquired. "Yes," Kate said promptly. "Please tell me about the blue feathers you and others are wearing. What is their significance?" "Ah, yes, the feathers," the vicar said, touching his own feather cluster with a finger. "A new temple has adopted the peacock as an emblem." Of course. Kate had never seen a peacock feather, but she had read of the bird. "For centuries," the vicar was saying, "the bird has represented immortality. The eyes depicted on splendid tailed figures suggest the supernatural ability to see deeply into the spirit. And of course, that is what we of the Golden Dawn are about. Seeing deeply into our hearts, the search of our souls." "I see," Kate said thoughtfully, wondering to herself whether she should convey this information to Sir Charles or keep it to herself. Aunt Sabrina put her arm around Kate's shoulders. "You must come and be introduced, Catherine. Annie Horniman wants to meet you, and Rachel Cracknell, and of course our dear Dr. Westcott, founder of our new order, for whom we all have such deep affection and respect." She smiled by the vicar. "If you'll excuse us, Barfield." "By all means," the vicar said, bowing. His eyes held a special warmth as she looked at Aunt Sabrina. "It is always good to see you once again, Sabrina. Soon, perhaps." "Indeed," Aunt Sabrina murmured and took Kate's elbow. After several other introductions and polite social conversation, Aunt Sabrina steered Kate toward a corner. Dr. Westcott, she whispered in Kate's ear. To Kate's surprise, Dr. Westcott proved to be the same man who had spoken so heatedly with Mrs. Farnsworth, but the mottled red had faded from his cheeks, and he smiled graciously when Aunt Sabrina introduced them. "Welcome to our order, Miss Hartley." His words were resonant, his sentences fully rounded. "Catherine is assisting me with our history," Aunt Sabrina put in. "She has an interest in ritual magic." Dr. Westcott's look became stern. "You understand, I trust, that our magical practices are not parlor amusements. They are handed down from the ancient through long line of individuals, priests, who communicate the sacred teachings to those who are willing to accept its esoteric discipline." He lifted his hand as if in blessing. His voice took on an even richer timbre. "This sacred work enables us to raise ourselves to an understanding of our inner truth, our inuring and divine genius." Kate inclined her head, feeling almost obliged to say Amen. She couldn't help wondering how Dr. Westcott's inuring divine genius had allowed him to be misled by the miscreant Mathers, and what, if anything, the order's emblem had to do with the broken blue feather she had found on the carriage that bore a man to his death.